Nabiyana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa barak wa sallam. All praise are due to Allah, Lord of the worlds, and peace and blessings be constantly showered upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad, his family, his companions, and all those who call to his way to the Day of Judgment. My beloved brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, again we are privileged to be able to look into the history of Islam, and especially in the Americas. And this understanding is becoming more and more critical for the survival of Muslims in this part of the world. Because with the present geopolitical situation in the world, and with Islam supposedly being a threat to the Western world, it is important for us to be able to deconstruct the lies, to be able to take apart the different lies that have been told about us and about the history of this part of the world, so that those people of conscience, those good people of other faiths, can understand more about their own history, and they can understand the mistake they are making by attacking Muslims, demonizing Muslims in the times that we are living in. And also that Muslims themselves can gain self-esteem, and we can begin to understand how important our presence is in this part of the world. And so we looked at deeper roots. We looked at different waves of Muslims who came across the Atlantic into the Americas. Of course, in early times, the people of Tawheed were found amongst the native people. And we recognize that in Canada, the Mi'kmaq Nation and the Cherokee in America and many different First Nations people had the belief in one God. But after the coming of the last Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he gave the instruction to his companions that those who are present on Arafat in this last farewell Hajj, that those people present should take the message to all those people who are absent. In other words, the Sahaba, radiallahu anhum ajma'in, had the responsibility to take Islam to the four corners of the earth. And so we find that most of the Sahaba did not die in Hijaz. They did not die in the Mecca-Medina area, but you'll see that they were in different parts of the known world, even reaching all the way to China itself, far north in the Russian Caucasus Mountains, deep south in the east coast of Africa, right across North Africa to the Atlantic, up into Spain and Portugal. And by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, within a few centuries, Muslims actually crossed the Atlantic. This is recorded in our early writings, great writers like Al-Mas'udi in his famous Muruj al-Dahab wa Ma'adil al-Jawhar, and Al-Idrisi in his famous geographical work. He talks about Muslims going across and finding islands and staying with a king who actually spoke the Arabic language, or he had a translator. And so Muslims were going across the Atlantic. And that might sound strange for somebody who thinks that Columbus was the first person to discover America. But we realize that even amongst Europeans, he was not the first European, because the Vikings came long before Columbus to the northern part, to Canada where we are living, and Newfoundland, and there are still ruins of the Vikings' settlements in Newfoundland in Canada today. So the reality is, people had been coming across, and there was much interaction between this part of the world, the Americas, and the other parts of the world, to the point where some of the key products that we are living off of today in the world actually came from the Americas. Potatoes started here. Tomatoes started here. Corn started here. Types of squash. Could you imagine the diet of people in the world if there was no corn and no potatoes and no tomatoes? Think about that. These are world international staples. and they originated in this part of the world. So there was interaction. And those who want to tell history from a proper perspective recognize this interaction. So Muslims came across, especially a large contingent in the southern area off the coast of Senegal, took the currents and landed in Brazil, and then went into the Central America and right up into the United States, into North America. And so in the early period, we have solid traces based on a number of different artifacts and writings and cultural points that are left for us. Following this, during Columbus's time, we recognize that Muslims were on the boat, that most of the people on the boats of Columbus and Balboa and Da Gama and the so-called discoverers, that they were actually Morisco galley slaves. And the Moriscos were Muslims who were forced to accept Christianity in the Inquisition. And again, it's important for us to understand history. Just the other day, President Obama made a speech in the United States, and he was talking about, the so-called barbarism in the Middle East. But he said, we should not be on high horses, because we, in Christianity, killed many people in the name of religion. And he mentioned the Inquisition. He mentioned the Crusades. And millions of people died because of this. But for a dumbed-down population that has no understanding of this, it is like he is a traitor. He's going over to the other side. But he was just being honest. And that's the reason why we need to understand this first, and to spread this information to other people, that yes, there were crusades, there was Inquisition, Muslims suffered in this, and actually were forced to flee to North Africa, to Turkey, and some were actually on the boats that came across to America, and they were part of the early society in the Americas. And we saw traces of them. One group called Melungeons, another called Lumbis. There are traces of these people, usually called Portuguese. They're usually called Christianized Portuguese. But they are a population, a recognizable population in the United States, in the southern part of the United States. After this, we saw another big wave coming in the slavery period. This is probably the largest wave of Muslims coming across, and of the millions of Africans who were brought to the Americas as political prisoners and slaves. We recognize now that somewhere between 15 to 30% of the people were Muslims. And so Muslims came across and were living in South America, in the Caribbean, in the United States, and documentation now has come to the surface, showing that there were scholars amongst the Muslims, that they actually played a role within the society. And the African American people living in the United States and the Caribbean and in South America are the descendants of those early Muslims who came in those early times. And it's interesting because two of the major tribes coming out of West Africa, Muslim nations, the Fulani nation, or they call Fula, and the Mandinka nation, were very active amongst the Muslims in the Americas, and they actually led many slave revolts. So there were scholars who came, there were movement leaders who were amongst the slaves, and that type of movement ideology put a lot of pressure on the system of slavery itself. Also, amongst the European people, there were those who had a conscience. And they said to themselves, how can we justify making human beings as slaves like this and destroying their culture, destroying the society? Is it worth having the money that we have? And so they started what is called the abolition movement. And abolition means that you want to cancel or abolish slavery. So the pressure now is coming from the inside, from the slaves themselves, led by Muslims in many cases, and on the outside by abolitionists, people of conscience, who still had heart left in their bodies, and they said, no, this slavery is not right. So the abolition movement then began, and the colonies now started to move toward a reduction or an end in slavery. And on these maps here, you can actually see traces of the roots of resistance that were going through the United States. And this is called the Underground Railroad. And so it's literally not under the ground, but sometimes it is in barnyards, and it is in homes of many European people who would hide the slaves. They would first run away from the plantation, and then they would hide, amongst the people. And there was actually a system that was set up where they could make it from the plantations in the south and actually go north, and in many cases cross the Canadian border. Because in Canada, there was more freedom. But we understand as well, and there's a recent book that came out, made into a set of movies called The Book of Negroes. And this actually showed that there were slaves in Canada who ran away to America from here. But for the most part, those who could cross the border, especially you'll see a crossing that happens in New York, and you see crossings that happen in Michigan, especially around Windsor. Windsor was one of the key areas, Chatham. In these areas, you'll see where the slaves actually made colonies. And so they developed an Afro-Canadian community. So this is a different community. And they had roots, and many actually reached over to Nova Scotia. And from Nova Scotia, with the freedom societies, many of them were given passage to go across to South Africa, to West Africa. And the countries of Liberia and Sierra Leone especially were developed as places, as colonies for those slaves and political prisoners who could escape the circumstances in the Americas and make it across. So this is how it looked now, literally on the ground. People going across, and what they had to face. This is a winter scene that you see. It was a difficult situation to be in, and there was a lot of bravery on the part of not only the Africans, but also of the Europeans who assisted in the Underground Railroad. On the left is a famous woman. Her name is Harriet Tubman, and she is probably one of the most famous people on the Underground Railroad. These are the ones that take you across. And Frederick Douglass. And what is interesting for Muslims to note about Frederick Douglass, and there's a person named William Thayer who did a study about the slaves who were living in the Carolinas and the islands off the coast of Georgia, that the Bilali family was a very large family. And so anybody who had the name Bela, which later was turned to Bailey, because they like to pronounce things in their own way when they're writing records. So they called the people Bailey. And there were no slave masters named Bailey in the area. So any African person with roots in that Bailey family actually more than likely came from the Saleh Bilali, the Bilali clan, who was a strong Muslim clan whose records are known to us now in the area. And one of the famous abolitionists, whose name was Frederick Douglass, from his mother's side was Bailey. So he's actually coming from a Muslim family. And this is a very interesting point. And even if you look at him, he has a very typical Fulani type of look that you'd find of the people who lived in the Fouta Djallon of Guinea and Sierra Leone and this area there. Another interesting point is that as the names change, because this is part of the slavery, they will change people's names. So the name Abu Bakr in West Africa was pronounced Boubacar. So if you meet somebody from Senegal, or his name Boubacar, it's a common name, and Boubacar actually is Abu Bakr, right? coming from the great Sahabi radiallahu anh. So Abu Bakr, actually when it's distorted in the writing, can become Buka. So Abu Bakr, Buka. Okay, and Buka, there was one famous educationist named Booker T. Washington, very famous in American history as well, who very possibly could have come from a Muslim family. So if Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington came from Muslim families, you got to rewrite American history. This is a big thing in America for those who understand American history. Amongst the abolitionists, also amongst the Europeans too, that I want to mention, there were many, but William Wilberforce was a very powerful abolitionist fighting for the freedom of the slaves. And of course, we know that over 1/3 of them are Muslims. And some of them actually took it from theory into practice. They actually fought for the liberation of African people. And one of them, his name is John Brown, and he was famous for a revolt that he literally led, an insurrection for the liberation of the African people and the end of slavery. So people were struggling against this very much. It was not a love thing at all. And it had to end. And so eventually, it was officially abolished in the British colonies. The British were the first. And so they officially abolished slavery on March 25th, 1807. And you can see in the writings here, even in this an old British paper, and it's even saying slavery is a time for an apology. There should actually be an apology. But unfortunately, there's no apology made up until today. These are millions of people forced to come to this part of the world who built up the society and are still suffering up until today. And this is a very important point for Muslims. We need to understand this point now. Because Muslims are now being victimized in the West in the same way that the original native people were victimized, and the African people were victimized who came, and the Hispanic people from Mexico and these areas were victimized as well. So we are being victimized in the same way. And many Muslims for a long time, we thought that we were something different. But there's some serious wake-up calls happening now all around, and we need to understand this history in order to understand our own history. One of the key points, however, in terms of the Muslims who came during this time, is that slavery, the form of slavery that took place here, is different than slavery in many other parts of the world. You had in other parts of the world, sometimes you had tough slavery like the Romans, and whatnot, but you had many cases domestic slavery, where people lived in the homes. Sometimes you had the type of slavery where people were clients of a master, like in Europe, Northern Europe, you had what they call serfdom. So the serfs were actually slaves. And you'll see the stories of King Arthur and many of the kings and the Round Table and whatever. And below in the villages were the serfs who literally could not move. They were property, literally the property of the king. These are the ones that this person named Robin Hood, right? He was supposedly fighting for their rights. So he's like an abolitionist, right? He's like a revolutionary. He's fighting for the rights of the serfs against the upper class. You see, so that's how that struggle goes. The difference in this form of slavery is that the people who lived as serfs in their villages and lived in villages in other parts of the world controlled by a dominant group, they still knew who they were. But the form of slavery in the Americas was extreme because the people were not allowed to speak their original languages. They had to learn to speak English or French in the French colonies, or Dutch or Portuguese or Spanish. They could not speak their own languages. So within a generation or two, the languages were lost. Because language is ada. It is like what you do normally. It's practice. And if you don't practice a language, you're going to lose your language. Unless, of course, the first 15 years of your life were spent speaking your language. But you'll see a child, very young child, could start off in the first couple of years speaking one language, travel to another place, and lose their first language completely. So just imagine now, the parents can't speak the language, and then the children only hear secret things being said. Then the mother is separated from the father. The children are separated from their parents. If you had religious practices, it was even worse. If they caught you making salat, or fasting in Ramadan, or reading the Quran, or trying to write it, sometimes you could be punished to death because of this. And they were especially afraid of Islam, because the Crusader mentality was still there, and they knew that Islam was a dominant force in the world. And so they did not want it to come back, or for Muslims to be able to reestablish Islam, because they know what Islam was bringing, and they didn't want it back. And so in the pain of slavery, people lost their culture, lost language, lost religion, and it became a faint memory in the minds of the people. And I can remember one of my colleagues who was in Medina with me studying, Imam Nafi Muhammad, rahimahullah, of Philadelphia. And he came from the South, and he remembers his great-grandmother, who actually lived around people who were in slavery. That's how close it actually is. And whenever she got angry at her children, and they're not Muslims, she used to say to them, "Y'all ain't nothing but Aunt Hagar's illegitimate children." This is American talk. And what she meant by that is, you're nothing but Aunt Hagar, Hajar, right? Hajar, your Hajar's illegitimate children. In other words, you're a bunch of Arabs. Whenever they got too wild, right? Then she'd call them, you're nothing but a bunch of Arabs, right? Or a bunch of wild Muslims. Because the Muslims were the ones making the revolts and running away and standing up for themselves. And she would say this not knowing what she was actually saying. It's actually a trace left of their Islam. And he eventually recognized that his family, they felt that they were not really Christians. They were not really Christians. But they didn't know what they were. And so eventually he searched, and he came into Islam. They left the South and went north to Philadelphia, and there he embraced Islam. In Brazil, where the Muslims in the Bahia area of Brazil and Salvador, they were very strong Muslims who came out of Nigeria. And they established, around 1835, they literally established an emirate. They had an emir, and they had their own territory, and they had shura, and they were serious. They were establishing themselves in the land. And a big revolt happened against the Portuguese, who were controlling there in South America, Brazil. And it was such a strong revolt that the Portuguese even said to many of them, "Okay, we're going to give you boats, and you can go back home." And now, today, if you go to Lagos, Nigeria, there's actually a Brazilian mosque that everybody knows as a Brazilian mosque, and you can pray inside that masjid. That Brazilian mosque was established by Muslims who were enslaved, fought, and came back and established the masjid there in Lagos, Nigeria. The revolt was eventually put down by the authorities, but the Muslims went underground, and they took their writings. They were writing to each other in classical Arabic. They had scholars amongst them, and they hid their writings in different places. And now, in the 20th, 21st century, their descendants are actually bringing up documents. And it's shocking to see that these are actual Arabic documents. Some passages from the Quran, some Maliki works, the writings of Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, the famous Maliki faqih, the scholar. These writings are coming up. It's an amazing thing. And they're actually coming to the surface. In Suriname, a great revolt took place, and the leader of the revolt was named, they called him Arabi. And his general was called Zamzam, like Zamzam water. So the general was called Zamzam. And they were so powerful that they went into the interior of Suriname, that's Dutch Guyana, right? They went into the interior, and they opened up the interior of Guyana, and they were nobody could conquer them. So the Dutch authorities made a treaty with them and allowed them to have their own constitution. Their own laws there. And, but over time, with the lack of knowledge being spread, they lost most of their Islam. And today, right now, alhamdulillah, there are Surinamese coming back into Islam in larger numbers. You see them in Holland, because the Surinamese go to Amsterdam. So you'll see them in Amsterdam, rising up, also in Suriname. So it's very interesting how the Islam can go down, become dormant, and then start to come up. One person even wrote that they went to Brazil and they found a group that said they were Muslims, and the only thing left of their prayers is that the woman would stand in a circle and they would clap, and the man would do a little dance in the middle, and he would say something. He would say, La ilaha illallah. That was salat. That's all they had left. Okay? And by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they are returning now. They're returning. So there's stories like this all over the region. In Trinidad, a Mandingo group, strong Mandingo warriors, liberated themselves, and they actually earned enough money to pay for their emancipation. They served in, the British hired them as mercenary soldiers. So they served as soldiers, and then they bought land outside of Port of Spain, Trinidad. And they cultured crops and everything. And when Trinidad had a great drought, it was the Muslims in the Manzila estate area outside of Port of Spain who actually fed the population and helped them to survive. And it was the descendants of these Muslims and Yunus Bath. They established a masjid downtown in Port of Spain. There is still Bath Street in Port of Spain, Trinidad, and there is a place that we had identified that could possibly be where they had their masjid. And so they integrated into the population. And that's probably the reason why you'll see in Trinidad itself a fast rate of reversion to Islam. One of the fastest rates of reversion in the Western world was actually in the area of Trinidad. And you see the strong background that is there, and then you will see, the reversion coming about. And so all over the territories, up into the United States, Muslim presence was there, but with the pain of slavery, it was being lost. And people were not able to hold on to their original roots. Now, alhamdulillah, because there were such large numbers in the United States, up until now, it is the fastest reversion rate now. I mean, the proportion is a huge proportion of people coming back into Islam in the United States. Up until today, there's still a large number of people in America amongst the African Americans who are embracing Islam in that region. And so this was the slavery period. This was a major wave of Muslims who came across. And inshallah, at the end, when we look at the awakening of Islam in the 21st century, you will see how the descendants who were coming out of that terrible situation of slavery actually, are a key element, in the reviving of Islam in this part of the world. I want to open up the floor for any questions that you may have concerning the slavery period. Do we have the other mic? I want to open up the floor if anybody has any questions, because we're about to change into another wave after this. So the slavery period. Yes, brother.
Well, it seems like we've moved from a position of power, in the sense of like, well, not dominance, but like our society was progressive and moving forward, and then we became slaves. Did anyone come to help us, like the rest of the Muslim community, like the other empires? Like, why is it that 30% of our population was able to become enslaved? Did anyone, what about the rest of the Muslim Ummah? Didn't they come to help the Africans? Why was that allowed to happen?
Well, I mean, this really is the same question that Spanish people, were asking. Remember the Inquisition in Spain, and this is now happening in, 13th, 14th, 15th century. Millions of Muslims, 3 million Muslims, driven out of, that's right in the Mediterranean. So where's the Ottoman Empire? The Ottomans at that time were on the other side, and they were strong, right? They were at war with Austria and stuff. Okay, so the question was there, why did the Ottomans not come, to rescue the Muslims in Al-Andalus? And I was in Turkey itself, and I went to a historian, and I asked him the same question. And he said to me, I'm not exactly sure, but if you look at the situation, the Ottomans were so tied down with the fighting going on in Austria on that front, on that side. They were so tied down. They were under a lot of pressure. They could not divert their main forces across the Mediterranean to that region. So what the Ottomans did do is they sent boats across. They sent across boats. And so it was Ottoman sailors. These are what they call the corsairs or the Barbary pirates. And that's the reason why, remember, some Turks were in America too, amongst the Melungeons. So the corsairs were able to help the Muslims escape from Al-Andalus and get across into North Africa. And the same Turkish corsair Barbary pirates, they also attacked the Spanish boats all around the Mediterranean, and they even chased them sometime into the Caribbean. This is where these pirates, Blackbeard and Bluebeard, and you hear all these wild stories. If you actually look closely, you'll see that some of them were actually Muslims fighting back. But they demonize it and make it into a story like they're all wild, crazy pirates. But the Barbary pirates were actually Berbers, right, Amazigh, coming from North Africa, who were struggling. So if you look at North Africa and then go around to West Africa, okay, and now later on, you're talking another 100, 200 years, and it's West Africa, which is far away from where the final Khalifa that we had was in Turkey. Okay, so when slavery was happening there, when boats are coming and people, they did not have the ability to send any forces around into that side. Even communication was cut off to a certain extent. And so the Muslim world really, some historians believe, and Allah knows best, that with the fall of the Abbasids, that was 1258, that was in Baghdad, when the Mongols sacked Baghdad, and they ended the Abbasid Khilafat. That really, from that time, we never fully recovered. We never fully recovered in terms of central leadership. Because even though the Abbasids at the end were weak, they were recognized as the Khalifa and as the central point of Islam by the whole Muslim world. Everywhere in the Muslim world. After the fall of Baghdad, when the final Khalifa of the Abbasids was killed, and then it was finally the Mamluks of Egypt, Saifuddin Qutuz, rahimahullah, who came back and they were able to defeat the Mongols. Right? And so the Mamluks, who were originally slave soldiers themselves, who took over Egypt, they became the de facto rulers of Islam. And because of their bravery and their education as young men, they were trained in Islam, and the fact that they fostered Muslim madrasas and universities, they were recognized as the leaders of Islam. But according to many historians, if you really look at Muslim history, the Mamluks only controlled the central parts of the Muslim world. Their influence did not go all the way to Southeast Asia and into China and then deep down into parts of Africa. They didn't reach that far. So from that time, we never fully recovered in terms of a central leadership. And although the Ottomans were courageous and held the banner of Islam up, the Ottoman Empire at its height did not fully influence the events of the whole of the Muslim world. But the heartland of Islam, they did influence that, and we accept them as the Khalifas. And we accepted when the Khilafat was abolished in Turkey, in the Ottoman lands, that it was the abolishment of the Islamic central leadership. Okay? But we never fully recovered. And that's probably the reason why people could only make dua and feel sad. But in far-off lands, they couldn't really influence the events. Now,
I would like to...
the mic is there. Just if it's a comment, make it a shorter one. And have a question 'cause of time.
I would also say that geography, transportation, technology, and resources played a big role, because you would have to have, if you look at West Africa and you look at maybe the east coast of West Africa, we're talking about almost 4,000 miles, and we're talking about a huge desert. And you would have to have a lot of resources and a lot of good communications to be able to bring armies from that side of the world over to West Africa to be able to engage those slave colonialist people.
That's right, and this is a good point, especially in terms of the naval technology, which at that point was the most important technology in terms of international trade and travel. The Portuguese and the Spanish and the British, they controlled much of the waters there. They controlled the waters. So we were only able to control the waters right around our ports of call. So therefore, it wouldn't have been possible. Any other general questions anybody has concerning this period? So this was, a very difficult time, for the Muslims who came to this part of the world. But, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a wisdom in everything. And in the conquered areas, now Muslims are actually rising from the conquered areas. And it may be Muslims in this part of the world who will play a very strong role in bringing some balance back. I mean, many of the people who are leading movements, not in the Muslim world, actually were educated somewhere here, found their Islam and went back. Okay, so Allah knows best what has happened. But this closes a very big, chapter for us in terms of the Americas. And, again, it's important for us to understand this and to do some even study on our own, about this and read some of the different, books, on this, in this area. And it's that same concept or that same relationship of slavery which is still spoiling people's relationship up until today. And that is the reason why in the United States that you see that the impact, of this, negative relationship never ended. And when slavery was over, and they're talking about barbarity now, the information has just come that between approximately 1871 and 1950, in the United States alone, over 4,000 people were lynched, African Americans, men, women, and children. They were lynched, they were hung to death in the United States. Okay? They had lynch mobs that if you were a person of African descent or Hispanic person, a person of color, and you went to the front door of a European man in the South, and you knocked on his door, there were cases of a person not going to the back door. They called the lynch mob and they lynched him to death. Another case of a person who just bumped into a European woman, just bumped into her, and they got a mob and they lynched him to death. One lynch mob in the South had approximately 10,000 people came out to watch the lynching of a person. Could you imagine this? And this goes right into the 20th century. Thousands of people coming out like you're going to the Super Bowl to watch the lynching of a person. Right? It's a sport, like it became a sport. Right? And then they say that things happen in the Muslim world are barbaric. When you look at the culture here, and what is being carried out in this part of the world. And that all goes back to this, wicked form of slavery, the Atlantic slave trade. But alhamdulillah, we will see that, out of this darkness, eventually came light. And there were many Muslims whose families and their descendants are actually returning to Islam. So we're going to take a break now, and inshallah, after Salat, we will continue on with a new phase of our waves of deeper roots. So let's take this break. Wabillahi tawfiq. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.